The year is 1473 before Christ, the west bank of the Nile, near Thebes. Dawn light bleeds across the desert, turning sand the color of old blood. A woman named Hanut Mer stands barefoot on limestone already hot enough to raise blisters. Her hands are bound behind her back with papyrus ropes so tight the fibers have embedded into swollen flesh. Around her neck hangs a wooden placard painted with hieroglyphics that spell out her crime: Adulteress. The word in ancient Egyptian carries weight that transcends simple translation. It means betrayer of Ma'at, the cosmic order that prevents reality from collapsing into chaos. It means polluter of bloodlines that connect pharaohs to gods. Her very existence now threatens the universe itself. 3 judges sit in the shade of a reed canopy, their faces hidden behind ceremonial masks depicting Anubis, the jackal god who weighs hearts against feathers. They have already pronounced sentence. The crowd that surrounds the plaza murmurs nervously, their fear a mix of reverence and relief that they are not the ones bound and condemned. Hanut can hear whispers that scratch at her ears. The gods will judge her. The river's curse will follow. She has doomed herself. Her stomach twists with shame, terror, and disbelief. She tries to remember the life that led her here, the market mornings spent weaving linen, the afternoons teaching her children songs and stories passed down through generations, the evenings laughing with friends while grinding grain in the courtyard. All of it feels like another life, distant and unreachably bright, like the sun just cresting the horizon. The placard around her neck swings with her every shudder. Her toes burn on the stone, but she cannot step forward, cannot kneel, cannot cry. The rope digs deeper into her wrists with every tremor, reminding her that the only control left in her body is her ability to endure. She looks up at the judges. The masks hide eyes that weigh her soul, but she imagines them cold, implacable, divine in their judgment. The crowd grows silent as the first ceremonial priest steps forward, a reed scepter in one hand and a small jar of natron in the other. Natron, they say, cleanses impurity, prepares bodies for the afterlife, but in Hanut's case, it is a reminder that her life is no longer hers to shape. Every ritual, every step of the punishment will be watched by neighbors, family, and strangers alike. She will not be able to escape the public eye. Her suffering is to be a lesson etched in flesh and memory. Hanut Mer breathes in the desert air, tasting dust, sweat, and fear. Her heart races, but beneath the fear, a quiet defiance flickers. She is more than a placard. She is more than a crime. And somewhere, deep inside, she refuses to let the universe see her as nothing. The priests begin their ceremony. Hanut closes her eyes, imagining the songs she taught her children. She hears the laughter of her friends in the courtyard, the river lapping gently against the banks where she used to wash linen. These memories are fragile shields against the crushing weight of her sentence. The crowd shifts, a few elders whispering prayers to themselves, a man clutching a staff muttering the names of gods who might intervene. Hanut hears the chanting of priests building in volume and rhythm, an ancient cadence meant to remind everyone that divine order is absolute, that Ma'at cannot be bent, and that one woman's sin could ripple across the heavens. And yet, in the silence between breaths, Hanut hears something else, her own heartbeat, stubborn and defiant. The memory of spinning the wheel at the loom, dyeing linen in complex patterns, the colors of the river reflected in her work. She was a creator, a teacher, a mother, a daughter, a friend. No law, no God, no judge could erase that. The priests begin the formal marking, painting hieroglyphics on her skin, symbols of shame meant to linger for all to see. Hanut flinches, biting back a scream,
and in that flinch she feels a spark of life, a reminder that even marked and broken, she exists. The sun rises higher, the limestone baking her feet, the placard swinging with every shudder, the ropes biting into her wrists, yet Hanout holds on to herself. She does not yet kneel fully, does not yet cry, does not yet surrender. She is more than her punishment. She is still Hanout Mare. The crowd watches, learning what punishment looks like, and though the lesson is meant to terrify, to instill obedience, to remind all women of the price of defiance, Hanout's silent defiance whispers back, she will endure. She will not disappear entirely. Somewhere, in some memory, some song, some whispered story, she will survive. Hanout Mare's story, like so many women before her, is about to be written in pain, fear, and endurance. And yet, even in this moment of terror, the spark of her humanity, the part that belongs to no law, no judge, no God, remains unbroken.
The gates of the house of correction groaned as Hanout Mare was pushed inside. The sound echoed off stone walls that had seen generations of women arrive in chains, women whose only crime was to exist as beings with their own desires. Dust rose from the floor, catching the morning light in pale streaks, but it did little to brighten the oppressive shadow that hung over the place. Hanout's bare feet scraped against rough stone, already cut and blistered from the march across the sun-baked sand. Each step felt like a betrayal of her own body, a reminder that the world no longer belonged to her. Her eyes searched for anything familiar, but there was nothing. No comforting reeds, no warmth of the Nile, no friendly faces. The air inside the house of correction was thick, stale with the breath of women who had suffered here before her. The smell of sweat, fear, and despair clung to every surface. She was pushed into a narrow corridor, the walls mined with iron rings embedded into stone, marks of restraint for those deemed too dangerous to control with mere ropes. The iron gleamed, but not with beauty. It gleamed with the cruel promise of pain, of submission, of erasure. A woman, older than Hanout, but bent and broken in ways that her youth could never have imagined, approached. Her hair hung in matted locks, her skin streaked with the residue of past punishment. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes alone told Hanout everything. The hopelessness, the inevitability, the cold efficiency of a system that had perfected the art of destroying women who dared claim autonomy. Hanout's placard, the one that branded her as an adulteress, was ripped from her neck. The act should have been relief, but it only left a hollow emptiness. The word remained, etched in her flesh, seared in her mind. Every woman in this place knew the weight of that label. It was not a crime in the way theft or murder might be. It was a crime against the cosmos, against time itself, and for that, Hanout would be unmade. The first task was simple: clean the stones, remove debris from the floors. But simplicity was an illusion. Each motion of her arms was watched. Each stumble, each faltering breath was catalogued as evidence of weakness, of moral corruption. Other women passed her silently, their eyes averted, their lips pressed into thin lines. Some whispered prayers that might save their souls, or curse theirs. Hanout could not tell which. Even the smallest act of defiance, a glance, a shiver, a sigh, could provoke the wrath of the overseers. Days blended into nights. Time here had no rhythm. The sun rose and fell, but Hanout never saw it fully, never felt its warmth on her skin. She worked from dawn to dusk, her body pushed to limits she had never known.
Hunger gnawed at her belly, sharp as the iron rings that awaited those deemed rebellious. Sleep was a fragile, fleeting comfort. She curled into corners, trying to conserve heat and hope, but both were in short supply. The walls seemed to press in, and the whispers of those who had come before haunted her. Every meal was a reminder of the control exercised over her. A thin porridge, cold and bitter, given in exact measures, nothing more, nothing less. She learned quickly. To beg was to be punished. To steal was to be punished. To refuse was to be punished. Obedience became a shield, but it could not protect the spirit. Hanut felt her identity fraying. Each day the vibrant woman who had once dreamed of teaching her son, who had sung to her children, who had crafted textiles that dazzled the eyes of merchants, seemed to drift further away. Voices sometimes pierced the monotony. The overseers, their faces hidden behind masks of Anubis or other gods, shouted commands. Their words were not for Hanut alone. They were a ritual, a reminder that she was part of a system far larger than her personal pain. One woman faltered and was dragged into the punishment chamber, her screams echoing like a bell through the corridors. Hanut could not look away, yet every fiber of her being screamed to close her eyes, to pretend it was not real. Weeks passed, though Hanut could not name them. She lost count of the sunrises, the steps across the stone floors, the hours of relentless work. Her fingers cracked, her palms bled, and the blisters on her feet became raw wounds. Her body, once a vessel of autonomy and life, had become a map of suffering. Every scar, every bruise was a letter in the story of her punishment, written in pain that no scribe could record. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the commands and the punishments, Hanut allowed herself to remember her son's laughter, her daughter's hands in hers, the scent of freshly dyed linen, the satisfaction of a pattern perfected. These memories were small lights in an otherwise endless darkness. They could not stop the cruelty of the house of correction, but they allowed her to survive it. Hanut Mir, adulteress, condemned, erased, yet still a woman who remembered, still a spirit that whispered resistance, still a human being refusing to vanish entirely.
The house of correction was never silent. Even when no one spoke, its walls whispered. Hanut Mir had come to understand that the building itself was alive with suffering, a vessel of despair that held the echoes of generations of women who had been dragged, screaming or silent, into its corridors. Each arrival brought a new shadow into the web of pain, a ripple that stretched through every stone, every iron ring, every corner where darkness had settled like dust. One morning, Hanut heard footsteps heavier than usual, dragging across the limestone floors. She turned to see a girl no older than 17, her body trembling with exhaustion, her hands raw from ropes that had cut into her wrists. Her eyes were wide with terror, pupils dilated, searching for a friendly face that did not exist. Hanut remembered herself in that gaze, the fear, the disbelief, the sudden awareness that life could collapse around you without warning. The girl's name was Mut Nofret. She had been accused of the same crime, though whispers said it was fabricated, a tool wielded by a jealous rival who desired her family's wealth. Her arrival disrupted the rhythm of Hanut's days, but in a strange way, it also brought purpose. She had someone to guide, to protect, even if in the smallest ways, showing which corridors to avoid, which overseers demanded attention first, how to survive on the smallest portion of food without drawing notice. Hanut saw in Mut Nofret the reflection of herself at the start of her sentence. The terror was palpable, but so too was resilience.
the spark that the house of correction sought to extinguish but could never entirely snuff out. She whispered small instructions, songs her mother had taught, fragments of hope that could fit into the cracks of despair. Time passed differently in this place. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Hanud watched women come and go, or sometimes disappear completely. Some arrived broken, some arrived full of fire, only to be ground into silence by the relentless machine of correction. She observed the hierarchy that emerged, those who conformed, those who resisted silently, those who tried to assert themselves and paid the price in pain or death. Every action, every choice had consequences that could echo for years. The overseers were unpredictable. Some wore masks of Anubis, others of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and vengeance. They moved through the corridors with mechanical precision, yet their cruelty was deeply personal, a mirror reflecting the fears and desires of a society that saw women as vessels of sin to be contained. They struck without hesitation, punished without mercy, and smiled without conscience. Hanud learned that survival required more than physical endurance. It demanded constant vigilance, careful observation, and a mind sharpened to anticipate cruelty before it arrived. Mutnofret began to speak one evening, her voice barely audible over the hum of exhaustion. She asked Hanud about her family, about her past life. Hanud wanted to tell her everything, but words felt dangerous, as though the air itself could carry secrets to the wrong ears. Instead, she offered fragments, enough to remind Mutnofret that life existed beyond these walls, that identity was not yet erased completely. Other women joined them in the evenings, forming silent circles where whispers carried more weight than spoken declarations. They shared scraps of food, stories from childhood, techniques for surviving punishment. In this fragile network, Hanud found a sense of agency, however slight. It was not freedom, it could never be, but it was a sliver of control in a place designed to strip control away completely. One day, the punishment chamber claimed another victim. A woman named Tawazret had resisted too openly, refused to obey orders, had spoken when silence was demanded. Her screams filled the corridors and left a heavy silence in their wake. Hanud and Mutnofret pressed themselves against walls, listening until the echoes faded. Later, they saw the marks left on her body, burns, cuts, bruises, all meticulously catalogued as examples to others. Hanud understood fully. Survival meant obedience, but obedience could never guarantee safety. Hanud's mind became a battlefield. Memories of her children, of her home, of the Nile, of songs and laughter clashed with the oppressive reality around her. Sometimes she felt herself slipping, a gradual dissolution of identity into the gray walls and harsh commands of the house of correction. But every evening, when the other women huddled close, she reclaimed pieces of herself. The act of remembering became a small rebellion, and in rebellion there was strength. Mutnofret began to show resilience. She learned to carry water without spilling, to avoid the watchful eyes of the overseers, to share her meager rations without attracting attention. Hanud watched with a mixture of pride and sorrow, pride for the girl's growing strength, sorrow for the world that demanded such lessons for mere survival. Together, they practiced small acts of defiance, a whispered song, a shared joke, a hand held briefly in comfort. Each act was a spark against the darkness, a signal that the system could take flesh and freedom, but not entirely the spirit. Hanud had come to understand the depth of her endurance. The house of correction had taken her freedom, her body, her comfort, her safety, but it had not fully taken her memory, her intelligence, her ability to teach, her capacity for love. Those were weapons she could wield silently against the system itself, against the inevitability of erasure. Henut Mir had entered the house of correction as an accused adulteress, a woman condemned not only by law, but by cosmic decree. Yet in the company of others, she discovered that survival required more than compliance. It required connection, empathy, and the preservation of humanity even when all else was stripped away. In the shadows among shadows, Henut and Mutnofret found a fragile light. It was faint, often flickering, threatened by cruelty and time, but it was enough to endure, enough to remember, enough to resist, quietly, within the confines of stone and iron, until the day when memory itself became a form of salvation.
Time in the house of correction had a strange quality. Days were measured not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the arrival of new punishments, the sound of footsteps on stone, and the small rituals women created to preserve a sense of order. Henut Mir had long lost track of how many moons had passed since her first day, but the memory of being bound under the scorching desert sun still burned in her flesh. Every scar, every mark, every ache was a reminder that her body no longer belonged to her. Silence dominated most of the corridors, but it was not peace. It was the heavy hush of fear, of anticipation, of women knowing that any misstep could bring the wrath of overseers. The silence pressed against Henut's chest, tightening with every passing hour. She had learned to move through it like a shadow, careful not to draw attention, careful not to breathe too loudly. But even silence could not mask her thoughts, and her mind became a battleground where hope and despair fought for dominance. Henut noticed subtle changes in the house. Overseers had begun to test her. Small commands, seemingly trivial, came with sharp eyes and veiled threats. Carry this basket, move this stone, scrub this floor, but always with an underlying expectation of obedience that if failed would be punished harshly. Each day was a negotiation with cruelty, a careful calculation of risk and endurance. Mutnofret remained her anchor. The young girl had grown stronger, more confident in navigating the labyrinth of oppression, but fear still flickered in her eyes when the overseers approached. Henut took it upon herself to teach Mutnofret resilience, not just survival. She taught her to carry herself with dignity, even when degraded, to speak softly yet firmly, to let small acts of agency shine through the darkness. It was dangerous, but it was necessary. Survival without spirit was no life at all. One afternoon, the overseers brought news of a new arrival, a woman accused of speaking against a high-ranking priest. Her body was already bruised, her eyes wild with panic, and her mouth trembling with words she could not speak. The sight brought Henut back to her first days, to the raw terror she had felt when the weight of accusation pressed against her like a stone. She guided the new arrival, quietly explaining the unspoken rules: where to stand, how to speak if spoken to, how to avoid drawing the gaze of Anubis. Yet Henut knew that knowledge was only temporary protection. The system was designed to erase identity, to transform women into symbols of transgression rather than people. She watched as the new arrival, once full of defiance, gradually succumbed to the relentless pressure, her spirit dimming under the weight of isolation and punishment. Henut felt a familiar anger, sharp and cold. This was not justice, this was deliberate cruelty, sanctioned by law and masked as righteousness. Night brought no relief. Women huddled together, whispering in the corners, sharing fragments of stories and songs. Henut listened to the murmurs of the past, the echoes of women whose names had been erased from history. She thought of Henut Mira, of Mutnofret's potential future, of all the countless lives consumed by the machinery of control. The House of Correction was not just a building, it was a repository of sorrow, a temple of suffering where memory was weaponized against humanity. Henut began to notice patterns in the overseer's cruelty. They thrived on unpredictability, forcing women to anticipate punishment without ever allowing certainty. They relished the tension, the fear that hung in the air like a tangible force. She started to document these patterns in her mind, committing to memory every shift, every command, every punishment cycle. Knowledge became a shield, subtle yet powerful, offering the possibility of resistance within the confines of their oppression. One evening, a cruel game was imposed. Women were forced to carry buckets of water across the courtyard, the sun beating down mercilessly, while overseers measured every misstep with scrutiny. Those who faltered were whipped, their cries piercing the dry air. Henut held her bucket with trembling arms, but she refused to let her fear dominate her. She guided Mut-Nofret alongside her, whispering encouragement, steadying her grip, reinforcing that endurance was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, spiritual. As the days stretched into months, Henut realized that silence could be a form of rebellion. By preserving her thoughts, her memories, her stories, she maintained a thread of humanity that the House of Correction could not sever. She began to teach the other women songs and small skills, subtle acts that reminded them they were more than their punishments. The overseers could crush bodies, but they could not entirely extinguish knowledge or the spirit of defiance quietly nurtured in corners. Henut's understanding of survival evolved further when she noticed the psychological warfare woven into every command. The overseers used shame as much as pain, stripping women of dignity and forcing them to internalize guilt. They manipulated relationships, pitting women against each other, creating distrust that weakened the bonds that might have offered solidarity. Henut resisted this with quiet determination, forming small alliances based on trust, teaching women to recognize manipulation, and fostering a sense of mutual protection. Even as oppression deepened, Henut found strength in the smallest victories. A whispered song, a shared meal, a hand held in solidarity, all became symbolic victories against the system. She knew these acts were fragile, easily crushed, but they also carried the power of memory, the continuity of identity, the assertion that life could endure even when controlled. The House of Correction was a place designed to erase women, yet in its shadows, Henut learned to cultivate light. She became a silent leader, a guardian of history and humanity, preserving the names and stories of women who had been silenced. Every day she survived, not only for herself, but for those whose lives had been consumed, for the generations erased before her, and for the faint hope that one day truth might outlast cruelty. Henut Mir understood that survival was not mere endurance. It was the quiet cultivation of identity, the preservation of memory, the defiance that persisted even when unseen. The weight of silence could crush the body, but it could not entirely crush the mind, the spirit, or the will to bear witness. In this understanding lay the beginning of a different kind of resistance, one not measured in immediate triumph, but in the preservation of humanity in the face of relentless oppression. And in the quiet moments, when the overseers were absent and the corridors held only shadows, Henut whispered the names of women who had come before, weaving memory into survival, refusing to let the House of Correction claim her soul.
Henut Mer had learned to bend without breaking, to endure without surrendering completely. Yet even in the relentless shadow of the House of Correction, a spark of rebellion began to flicker. It started as a thought, small and almost imperceptible, a whisper in the back of her mind. I am more than this place thinks I am. The day began like any other, with the screech of wooden doors opening and the overseer's boots striking stone floors. Women shuffled into the courtyard, carrying heavy baskets, their eyes fixed on the ground to avoid provoking the wrath of authority. Hanut moved quietly among them, her mind alert for any sign of weakness in the system. That morning, a new challenge was imposed. Overseers demanded that women clean the inner walls of the house, scraping centuries of grime and neglect with primitive tools. The sun glared down, unforgiving, while the overseers paced behind, their eyes sharp, their whips ready. The task was designed to break bodies and spirits alike. Yet Hanut recognized the opportunity hidden in it, a chance to demonstrate unity, subtle defiance, and control over the smallest freedoms. She began directing small acts of quiet resistance. When buckets of water were required, she coordinated with others so that each woman's load was shared in a way that eased suffering without attracting notice. When a new arrival faltered, she offered support under the guise of obedience, whispering instructions that helped her fellow prisoners survive. These were not grand gestures. They were subtle manipulations of circumstance that created pockets of relief, tiny spaces where women could breathe without the overseer's gaze. Mutnafret watched closely, absorbing every move. The young girl had matured, her eyes no longer wide with fear, but sharp with understanding. Hanut knew the importance of this education. It was more than survival. It was the transmission of knowledge that the house wanted erased. Each whispered instruction, each quiet encouragement was a small act of rebellion against a system designed to erase identity. One afternoon, the overseers introduced a new form of cruelty, forced storytelling. Women were to recount their alleged crimes in the courtyard, publicly confessing guilt while their peers watched. The punishment was both physical and psychological. Those who faltered faced lashes, humiliation, or extended labor. The exercise was meant to destroy dignity, but Hanut approached it with a different perspective. When her turn came, she did not falter. She spoke slowly, deliberately, recounting her crime with a tone that conveyed compliance but revealed nothing of her spirit. Beneath the words, her mind traced the contours of resistance, memorizing every reaction from the overseers, every subtle glance from fellow prisoners. She understood that storytelling could be weaponized. If wielded wisely, words could preserve identity rather than destroy it. The following days revealed the consequences of these small revolts. The overseers grew suspicious, their scrutiny harsher, their punishments more unpredictable. Yet Hanut had discovered a critical truth. The House of Correction relied as much on fear and isolation as on brute force. The smallest assertion of agency, carefully executed, could shift power even slightly. It was a dangerous game, but one she was now willing to play. Hanut also began to explore the house's hidden spaces. There were corridors seldom used, rooms forgotten by routine, corners where sunlight barely reached. She mapped these in her mind, identifying spaces where women could communicate in secret, exchange information, or even pass along small items of comfort, a shard of bread, a token of memory, a scrap of cloth. Each small act built trust and solidarity, quietly undermining the overseer's authority. One night, Hanut discovered a hidden cache of writing materials, parchment scraps, broken styluses, and charred ink. It was a treasure beyond measure. She began recording the stories of women who had been silenced, sketching names, dates, and events. Each note was a rebellion against erasure, a refusal to let memory die. The task was exhausting and perilous, yet she persisted, understanding that even if discovered, the act itself held power. Mutnafret joined her in this effort, and together they chronicled stories of courage, endurance, and quiet defiance. Hanut's voice became a lifeline, linking the present with the past, ensuring that no woman's suffering would be forgotten entirely. Even the smallest act of remembrance became revolutionary within the walls of oppression. Over time, the overseers noticed the subtle shift. They could not pinpoint the cause, but they sensed that control was slipping, that the women were no longer entirely silent, entirely compliant. Punishments became increasingly erratic, designed to instill paranoia. Yet Hanut's careful coordination and unwavering spirit allowed small networks of trust to persist, slowly spreading hope like a hidden flame. In the deepest silence of the night, Hanut reflected on the nature of power. The house of correction was formidable, but its strength relied on the obedience of fear. If fear could be managed, reshaped, and shared, it became possible to reclaim fragments of freedom. Resistance did not require overthrowing the system entirely. It could start with whispering a name, sharing a story, or simply surviving with dignity intact. Hanut realized that survival itself was a form of rebellion. Every day she preserved her identity. Every day she guided others. Every day she defied the total erasure of her existence. She fought a quiet war against cruelty. The House of Correction was designed to crush the spirit, but she had discovered a way to bend without breaking, to resist without being caught, to sow seeds of defiance that could grow even in darkness. By the end of the chapter, Hanut had become more than a survivor. She was a guide, a guardian of memory, and a subtle architect of resistance. The House of Correction remained a place of suffering, yet within it, Hanut had carved out spaces of humanity, solidarity, and hope. She understood that the battle would be long, the stakes deadly, but the smallest acts of defiance, words, gestures, preserved memories, could endure longer than pain, longer than oppression, longer than fear.
The sun had long vanished behind the western dunes, leaving only shadows to stretch across the deserted streets of Thebes. Centuries had passed since Hanut Mir's feet had blistered on the limestone, since her hands had been bound and her name painted as a crime against cosmic order. Yet the echoes of her suffering persisted. They traveled silently across time, settling into legal codes, traditions, and beliefs that continued to shape the lives of women centuries later. Hanut Mir had been one woman, caught in the machinery of a system designed to erase her. But she was not alone. Across Egypt, in its courts and houses of correction, women had been transformed into warnings. Their punishment was never just about them. It was about everyone else who might think to step beyond the boundaries set by men and by law. In that sense, Hanut's life and her death became something larger than herself, a story repeated in shadow, a system codified in cruelty. The judges who had sat under the reed canopy, faces hidden behind the masks of Anubis, had been instruments of a principle older than any king or city. Female sexuality is property, and property must be controlled. Every act of adultery, every claim of female desire outside the bounds of male authority was treated as a threat not merely to families, but to the cosmic order itself. The punishment Hanut endured, the binding, the branding, the erasure, was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a form of instruction, a message carved into the world. Deviation is dangerous, and the consequences are absolute. This logic, harsh as it seems, did not vanish when the Nile kingdoms fell. Roman law, centuries later, adapted these Egyptian principles, transforming them to fit a new empire. Adultery remained a crime primarily for women, and the punishments remained gendered. Public humiliation, whipping, and confinement were inherited directly from Egyptian practices. When the Byzantine codices compiled laws under Justinian, the texts explicitly preserved the asymmetry. The male offender was barely mentioned. The female offender faced the full weight of state and society.
Medieval Europe took this inheritance and layered additional terrors upon it. Women accused of adultery could be branded, locked in convents, or exposed to the public eye in ways that reinforced shame. The logic was consistent. A woman's body was not her own. Her autonomy threatened social order. Her violation justified extreme measures. Even the concept of honor killings, where families executed female relatives accused of sexual impropriety, descended in part from this lineage of legal thought. When the family's social standing depended upon a woman's sexual purity, her death could be considered necessary. The specifics changed, but the underlying pattern remained identical to that which Henut Mir faced. Even today, the echoes remain. Across the world, women continue to face violence justified by claims of morality, honor, or social order. Laws permitting forced marriage to rapists, laws criminalizing adultery disproportionately for women, acid attacks marking female transgressors. These are the modern faces of a system that began thousands of years ago along the Nile. Honor killings claim the lives of thousands of women every year. Intimate partner violence continues on a scale that mirrors the authority ancient law granted husbands over wives. Even subtle measures, like the weighting of women's testimony in courts or restrictions on movement and work, carry forward the Egyptian principle: women must be controlled, and deviation requires punishment. Henut Mir's story is not just history. It is a mirror held up to contemporary society. Her 9 years of polluted labor, her death in silence, the erasure of her identity from family and public memory, all of it reflects a truth too often ignored. Systems of law and government can codify cruelty. They can transform suffering into procedure and obliterate individual humanity under the guise of order. And when we fail to acknowledge this truth, we allow the patterns to persist, invisible yet devastating. We can see the legacy most clearly in the lives of individual women. Take the mothers and daughters whose names never appear in genealogies because a conviction removed them from the family record. Take the skilled artisans whose work was credited to men or forgotten entirely because their existence was legally nullified. Take the thousands of girls and women forced to endure violence justified by ancient legal reasoning, just as Henut endured. Their lives, like Henut's, matter, not just as statistics, but as vivid human experiences. Henut Mir herself had been a woman of substance, a mother who sang to her children, who wove cloth with skill passed down through generations, who dreamed of a future for her son and daughter. Her life was rich with connections, knowledge, and love. But the moment she was accused, all of that was treated as irrelevant. The legal system erased her identity, converting a living, breathing woman into a category, adulteress. For 9 years, she survived as an object lesson, her suffering deliberate and systematic. And in death, she was removed from memory as thoroughly as law and custom could achieve. Yet even erased, her story survives through fragments, protest texts, administrative records, and most importantly, the resonance of her suffering across time. For every Henut Mir, there are countless others whose names will never be recovered. Mutnofret, murdered by a system protecting her abusive husband. Tawazret, a powerful queen destroyed by political enemies who weaponized adultery laws. These women, like Henut, were not anomalies. They were products of a persistent pattern, a societal structure that measured value and punishment according to male authority. Remembering them is essential, not merely as an act of historical curiosity, but as a moral obligation. Every story recovered interrupts the cycle of erasure, restoring dignity to lives intentionally made invisible. It reminds us that civilization's achievements are inseparable from its depths of cruelty. The temples, the scribal archives, the architectural marvels, all were built in a world that sanctioned systematic destruction of women's autonomy. Acknowledging that does not diminish human achievement, it clarifies it. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, and through that confrontation, to imagine a different, more just world. Henut Mir's legacy is thus twofold. On one hand, it is a story of suffering, injustice, and erasure. On the other, it is a testament to survival, memory, and the moral imperative to resist oppression. Her story teaches us that legal systems are not neutral instruments of justice. They are reflections of values and power. And when those values are rooted in inequality and control, the consequences are lived daily by the most vulnerable. As the shadows lengthened over Thebes, the wind carried no memory of Henut's cries or her footsteps. The limestone where she had stood, burned by the sun, had long since crumbled. Yet her presence remained in the patterns of law, in the continued struggles of women across centuries, in the whispers of memory that insist on telling her story. For every injustice perpetuated in silence, there is the responsibility to speak. For every life erased, there is the duty to remember. And for every Henut Mir, there is a chance to honor her existence by recognizing the enduring power of these stories and ensuring that history's lessons are not lost.
The Nile flows endlessly, carrying stories old as civilization itself. The currents do not distinguish between rulers and the ruled, between kings and the women condemned for defiance. Henut Mir's story, once confined to a single sheet of papyrus, now flows into the consciousness of those who remember. Her suffering, her erasure, her death, all these resonate across millennia, a quiet but persistent echo in the human story. Imagine Henut standing in that desert light, 9 years of forced labor etched into her bones. Imagine her children growing up believing she had vanished, her songs and teachings silenced by law and fear. Imagine the world continuing, indifferent, as justice hid behind procedure and ritual. It is almost impossible to reconcile the banality of life continuing with the enormity of her suffering. And yet this was and remains the pattern of systemic oppression. The lessons of her life are not abstract. They are immediate, visceral, and necessary. The logic that sentenced Henut to destruction is the same logic that today underpins laws and traditions in numerous societies. Female sexuality as property, honor as justification for violence, punishment masquerading as morality. When we recognize these patterns, we see that the past is not dead. It lives in contemporary legal systems, in cultural practices, in the everyday control of women's bodies and choices. But Henut's story also shows the power of memory. Even though authorities tried to erase her, fragments survived. A husband's protest preserved by chance. Administrative records that speak more through absence than presence. Archaeological traces that hint at lives interrupted and destroyed. These fragments are not mere historical curiosities. They are acts of resistance. They demand that we look, that we see, that we remember. They insist that the human cost of law and order be acknowledged, even if the original witnesses are long gone. Consider the women whose lives intersect with Henut's story through history. Mutnofret, 17, murdered under laws protecting her abusive husband. Tawazret, a queen whose political power was undermined by accusations of adultery. These are not isolated incidents. They are part of a web of systemic oppression that stretches from the Nile of 1473 BC to the present day. Every law that diminishes a woman's autonomy, every cultural practice that treats female bodies as family property, every act of violence justified by honor, continues the logic that destroyed Hanut. And yet there is hope in recognition. Every time Hanut's name is spoken, every time her story is told, a small act of justice occurs. Her erasure is challenged. Her suffering is acknowledged. The lessons of her life become tools for awareness, for change, for resisting systems that treat people as objects to control rather than human beings to respect. History is not simply a record of cruelty. It is a guide for preventing cruelty in the future. Modern examples are stark. Countries that criminalize adultery disproportionately for women, cultures that excuse honor killings, domestic violence statistics that echo centuries-old property logic, all show how patterns persist. But awareness is the first step toward resistance. By understanding that the injustice Hanut faced was not an anomaly, but part of a historical continuum, we can challenge its modern forms. Each story recovered strengthens this challenge, turning memory into action. Hanut's life also teaches us about resilience. Despite her erasure, she survived as long as survival was possible. She sang to her children, taught them the skills she loved, and left traces of her existence through labor, love, and memory. Survival, even under the most brutal conditions, is a form of defiance. And when we tell her story now, we continue that defiance, refusing to let her life be reduced to silence and oblivion. The physical remnants of her world, the temples, the papyri, the limestone courts, stand as silent witnesses. Tourists walk the same ground where women were punished, often unaware. The House of Correction beneath Karnak Temple closed to the public still bears the scars of its victims. These places do not forget, even if humanity does. By confronting them, by understanding their histories, we honor the lives that were broken there. In reflecting on Hanut, we also reflect on ourselves. Her story asks us to consider the systems we accept as normal, the laws we obey without question, the cultural norms we reproduce unconsciously. How often do we encounter rules or traditions that perpetuate inequality? How often do we allow history's lessons to remain invisible while injustices persist? The memory of Hanut Mir challenges passivity. It challenges silence. It demands recognition and action. Hanut Mir's legacy is not confined to history books or academic study. It is alive in the ongoing struggle for women's autonomy and human rights. It is present whenever laws or traditions reduce a person to property, whenever honor is used to justify violence, whenever injustice is codified as procedure. By remembering Hanut, by telling her story, we refuse to let her suffering be forgotten. We give her the dignity that was denied in life. And finally, her story reminds us that human progress is never purely linear. Civilization can achieve astonishing heights, temples, mathematics, writing, art, while simultaneously perpetuating profound cruelty. To honor the achievements of the past, we must also acknowledge the atrocities. To celebrate knowledge and culture, we must confront oppression. Only by doing both can we fully understand history, and only by understanding history can we hope to prevent repeating its mistakes. Hanut Mir's name, once destined for erasure, now lives, not as a footnote, not as a statistic, but as a story of survival, memory, and warning. A story that echoes across time, reminding us that law and order are not neutral forces. They reflect the values of those who wield them. Her life, her suffering, her erasure, and her posthumous recognition teach us that remembering is resistance, that witnessing is responsibility, that human dignity must be preserved even when history tried to destroy it. Her story ends not in silence, but in resonance. Across the sands of Egypt, across the corridors of time, across modern societies still grappling with the logic of control, Hanout Mir's legacy calls out to see, to remember, to act. And in answering that call, we honor not just Hanout, but all the women whose lives were stolen, whose names were erased, whose stories were silenced. Their suffering is real, their humanity undeniable, their memory sacred. The Nile flows, endless and patient, carrying their stories forward. And now, because we remember, they are no longer invisible.